Hi everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar about maintaining IT security when working remotely. Before we get started, just some practical things to go through. This session is being recorded, so you will all receive a recording of this webinar later on. Also, everyone here on this call has been forced to be on mute. So we are leaving time though at the end for some questions. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please go ahead and enter them in the Q&A chat box, and we'll keep track of them and leave time at the end and try to get to as many questions as we can. Okay, so in today's webinar, we'll be talking about maintaining IT security when working remotely. And talking to you today is me. My name is Martha, and I'm the head of product marketing here at LogPoint. And I have a lot of experience working within the tech industry, and I kind of pride myself on being able to explain complex things simply. So you'll have to let me know in the end if I succeed with that. And I'm really happy today on the call joining me is my colleague Niels. He's a sales engineer at LogPoint, and he has tons of experience and does killer product demonstrations. So later on, you'll be able to see him live doing some LogPoint and UEBA product demonstrations. So stay tuned for that. He's really great at it. And just going through really quickly what we'll be talking about today, I'll be going through some of the challenges of remote working when employees are working from home, how you can solve some of those challenges by monitoring your extended network. And then there'll be that great product demonstration from Niels, and we'll wrap up with some time for questions. So let's get right into it. It's not news that a lot of people are working from home. I'm sure some of you on the call today are working from home. I'm actually working from home today here in Sweden. And even though a lot of people are working from home now due to the corona crisis, it's not a trend that's going to be going away, working from home. Working remotely is here to stay because there are tons of studies out there that highlight the benefits to employees of working from home, such as 86% of people feel that working remotely reduces stress. Employees really benefit from a flexible schedule. But it's not just employees that benefit, employers benefit too, because companies that allow remote work have 25% lower employee turnover than those that don't. So saving some money there, keeping employees year after year. And if we look to the future, studies show that 73% of all departments will have remote workers. So if we have all of these positive things about remote working, what could possibly go wrong? Well, there are some challenges when you have people working from home, and let's look at an example of that. So let's take your office, the place you work, and in that office, you have all of your IT infrastructure. You know, your computers, your users, your printers, what have you. And all of that infrastructure is within a nice, organized, secure office network. But what happens is when you have people working from home is they're physically outside that network. But you can't just regard the place that they're working from. Instead, you need to expand your network perimeter. So all of that sudden, that safe network perimeter you had at the office is expanding to include all of your employees' homes. And let's say you have some employees who might be working from a public space, such as a coffee shop or even a library. Your network has to expand to include them too. So all of a sudden, that nice secure network you had, you don't really know where it begins and ends. It's including employees' homes and these different public spaces. And if it's the case that you have an employee using some public Wi-Fi at a library, for instance, and they get infected with malware, as soon as they come back to the office, that'll spread super quickly from employee to employee. And so really in this scenario, there's no antivirus software or more firewalls that are going to help. In fact, I'm sorry to say, but there's really not a whole lot you can do to completely prevent an attack. But what you can do is you can monitor what's happening. You need a way to monitor the entire network so your company isn't at risk. And that's what a SIEM can do for you. SIEM is Security Information and Event Management, And it's a tool that monitors devices both within and outside your network. So in addition to those IT infrastructure components I talked about previously, it can help monitor those. It can also help monitor components that are outside that safe network, such as employees' homes or the cafe. And the way that a SIEM can do that, it can monitor cloud applications like Microsoft 365 and Salesforce. And an important point to note here is 365 is a super common cloud application. I'm sure a lot of you are using it in your workplaces. And one important thing to note that as soon as you have employees working with a cloud-based platform like Microsoft 365, they're automatically outside of your network, regardless of their physical workspace. As soon as you introduce a cloud-based platform into your organization, you need to consider how are you monitoring your extended network perimeter. And that's something that LogPoint can do. A SIEM can also help monitor remote authentication, such as VPN. And I know that Niels will be going through a demo of how this works later on. A SIEM can also monitor email phishing, such as fake alert campaigns. And now with the time of the corona crisis, we've really seen that email phishing is on the rise. It's a tactic that a lot of threat groups are using. So it's important you have a tool to be able to monitor what's happening. And a SIEM can also help monitor insider threats, such as credential sharing or access to sensitive data. So now that we've gone through a very general understanding of what a SIEM can do, let's look at a specific use case. So let's look at Office 365, because like I said, it's one of the most widely used cloud-based platforms, and LogPoint has out-of-the-box support for it. So here's how LogPoint can help with 365. It can give IT security departments the ability to keep track of changes made within the entire cloud ecosystem, such as monitoring email activities for Exchange. And this includes attachments and other media in the emails. Because like I said, email is one of the most prominent data exfiltration methods, because threat actors are using various sophisticated tactics to spread spam, malware, or scams, such as CEO fraud. So it's really critical that we have a tool that allows us to keep track of fraudulent and abnormal email behavior. And when you have a SIEM tool like LogPoint, email activities are easily traceable, so you can keep your confidential, critical information safe. So even if you have a SIEM, you might be thinking, okay, I'm totally protected, I don't need to worry anymore, but you might want to consider boosting your SIEM capabilities with UEBA, because machine learning accelerates detection. UEBA stands for User and Entity Behavior Analytics, and you can basically think of it as a way to make your SIEM even smarter. So what can a UEBA do? Well, it analyzes behavior of users and entities, and it finds unusual or malicious behaviors and patterns, and it does all of that by using machine learning. So that was a lot of words that just came out of my mouth. So let me try and illustrate that with a more concrete example. Let's say you have an employee and his name is Bob. And as part of Bob's job, he needs to access sensitive, confidential information. So it wouldn't really make sense to set up a rule that we get an alert every time that confidential information is accessed, because it's okay for Bob to do it. It's part of his job. At the same time, we need some kind of rules to know what Bob is doing. You know, we want to know, maybe does he access that information in the middle of the night, which he normally doesn't do, so why is he doing that? Or maybe we want to know that all of a sudden he starts accessing this information 10 times more than he needs to in order to do his job. That would be something we would want to know. It would be very cumbersome to set up individual rules to try and predict all the different things Bob can do. Instead, with UEBA and machine learning, all of that is done automatic for you. And another great thing about UEBA is it creates this actionable to-do list of the most abnormal users or entities. So it's really easy for you to get a bird's eye view of who should I be focusing on, what should I be focusing on, what have they done that's causing this risky behavior alert to come up. And in a general sense, you can consider that UEBA builds baselines of normal activities for users and user peer groups. And this is based on hundreds of different dimensions. And so an example of how this works in Office 365 is tracking malicious insiders. So let's say you have an employee who's been terminated. You need a way to determine if he's a threat to your organization before he leaves. You can use UEBA to do that. So let's go back to our good friend Bob and use him as an example. So what can UEBA do to help us with Bob? Well, it can track all of Bob's behavior, his logins and authentication in Microsoft 365, so we can know when he's logging in. We can also get alerts for unusual logins or activities at unusual times. So let's say Bob starts accessing this confidential information in the middle of the night, something he's never done before, and he does it every day. Okay, that's something that we want to get an alert for because that's unusual for him. And the cool thing about UEBA is we can evaluate Bob's behavior against both Bob's known baselines and his peers. So this is super helpful. Let's say all of a sudden we see that Bob is accessing this confidential information 10 times more than he normally does. But at the same time, his entire team is doing the same thing. Let's say there's a campaign going on. So more access is needed to this confidential information to create this campaign. Then we don't need an alert for that because that's okay that Bob does it because his team is already doing it. So it's more of an expected behavior. It's not that unusual. And you can see a really good example of this on the screenshot here on the screen. This is for a user named Joshua, and it's about how many times he's accessed a shared drive. You can see that the average for Josh and his peers is about 1 time he would access this drive. And the expected highest amount he would access between Josh and his peers is between 2 and 3. And then you can see the actual observed number of times he's accessed this drive is 38. That's a huge discrepancy and is something that's unusual. So we should definitely look into what's happening there. And the final thing that UEBA does is it provides alerting context. Alerting context means that we can evaluate the chain of alerts raised, and each time an alert is raised, we can evaluate how common that chain of alerts is. And if certain things never happen in sequence, then we definitely know something is up. So let's take Bob. Let's say he accesses that confidential information late at night. And he does that from time to time. So that action in and of itself isn't super abnormal because he does do that here and there. But then let's say one of these times he's in the middle of the night, accesses this confidential information, and then downloads all of it to a USB drive. This chain of events, accessing the information late at night, followed by downloading it to a USB drive, that's suspicious. That's not a sequence that Bob has ever had before. So that's something we want to know about and see if it's something we need to investigate. Now, all of these things that I'm talking about that UEBA can do, you could do all of it without machine learning. But machine learning is what makes it automatic. And that's super powerful because that takes away tons of work from you and it helps you detect things that would be super difficult to detect if you had to make individual rules, regular rules for every little thing. Then, if we want to take UEBA and put it into a greater context of threat management, we can do that using the Mitre Attack framework. If you haven't heard of Mitre Attack before, it's a standardized way to classify threats all the way beginning with initial access to privilege escalation, to lateral movements, to data exfiltration. Basically, you can consider Mitre Attack a knowledge base of hacking techniques and tactics that help you plan your cybersecurity strategy. And at LogPoint, we think Mitre Attack is super important, and we've really been focusing on it. And in fact, we've mapped all of our analytics, including UEBA alerts, to the attack framework. And because LogPoint integrates with other security tools, you can get your entire infrastructure using the same standard alerts. And here on the screen, you can see a sneak peek of an attack navigator that we've built. And this will soon be introduced on our website as well as inside our product. And what this navigator shows is it shows the different alerts that will trigger inside LogPoint. And the alerts in LogPoint are configured to the different stages of the attack framework. So when you work with Mitre Attack, it's much easier to get situational awareness of the entire system. But Mitre Attack is also beneficial in some other ways. For example, it gives you faster detection and response. Because the Mitre Attack alerts are based on a standard framework, it makes it easier for analysts to detect malicious activity and help them predict an adversary's actions so they can be one step ahead of the investigation. Attack also helps with comprehensive risk assessment. It's much easier to visualize and map security coverage when defenses are based on the same taxonomy, when the alerts are the same. Also, Mitre Attack helps teams understand how the adversary is working because, let's be real, you can't really create a defense to protect your system if you don't understand the offense and how they are working. Mitre Attack can help you do that. And it can also help minimize cybersecurity skills gap. Mitre Attack can help the junior security analyst who may not have that much experience. It can give them a knowledge base to figure out how to investigate and respond. So now that we've seen what SIEM and UEBA solution can do to keep your business secure, even when employees are working from home, let's look at what makes LogPoint particularly suited to help. So what do we have that the others don't? Well, when it comes to our product and the technology, we have some of the best detection and classification. Like I said, we've completely mapped all of our analytics to the Mitre Attack framework, which is super beneficial. We also have the industry-leading single query language that works across all data sources. And basically what this means is it gives you higher quality data. And when you have higher quality data, that leads to faster machine learning deployments. It's that old adage, high quality in, high quality out. But don't just take my word for it. We've also been recognized by third parties such as Gartner. And in fact, this year, they've named LogPoint the only visionary. And this is based, in addition to our products and technology, it's based on the fact that we have true predictive pricing, which is based on the number of nodes rather than the amount of data. So you always know how much you're going to pay. Our comprehensive data privacy capabilities that always keep personal data safe. Our native support for MSSP operations. We always make sure our partners have the tools they need to serve their customers. And with LogPoint, you can also expand your threat detection to business applications, including ERP systems. So again, that whole idea, you can monitor your entire system. And our customers also tend to agree that we're pretty great. We have a 98% customer satisfaction rating in service and support, and our customers tend to return to us year after year to continue working with LogPoint. And recently, we were even ranked #1 by customers for the best customer experience by Infotech. So that's something we're really proud of. And so with that, I would like to go ahead and pass on the presentation to my colleague Niels, who will now do a product demo for you.
Thank you everyone for joining. So what you can see here is the web interface for LogPoint, and I'm going to take you through some of the data and also some of the tools that we have in LogPoint to answer some of the questions that our customers have asked us, especially recently around remote working and the kind of challenges they face with that. So the first important area is visibility. I think that applies to normal times as it does now. And that is something that customers are struggling with, understanding what their users are actually doing, where they're coming from, and maybe also what kind of problems they're having with remote sessions with logins and so on. So when we think about the data sources that we want to bring into a SIEM, that is a really important one. Any sort of authentication log, whether that's on-premise or whether that's through something like Azure AD. And in this case, this is a dashboard that comes with LogPoint, as do many others, to visualize that data that we are ingesting. So in this case, it's local Kerberos information. For this, you might need endpoint logs. There's a lot of different ways that we support of getting them. And you get an overview of, for example, the successful versus failed logins, failure reasons, who are the users that keep locking themselves out, and so on. So that's an important area that people want to see, and you can see how that might develop over time. So these dashboards are really a high-level overview of that kind of activity, and maybe you can use them to spot certain trends and developments, but certainly get a better handle on what's happening. So that is one of the important data sources. That's in terms of activity, but also what's important is understanding what is actually happening to your user accounts. So this is now a dashboard that looks at the Active Directory data, maybe from a domain controller, and you can see how accounts get changed in your environment. So, for example, there might be administrator accounts that get created and deleted. And again, there is probably a certain level of activity that you would normally expect, but then there could be anomalies that you can just visually spot in here. And that's by no means the only way of detecting that. And I'll come to that in a second. If we look at a different data source, and Martha's spoken about it, especially when it comes to remote working, Office 365 is of increasing importance. The nice thing about ingesting data from Office 365 is that by just configuring that single data source, you get all the activity that's happening in that environment. And some of this you can obviously get on-premise from the on-premise version, something like Exchange and SharePoint and so on, you can get locally. But with Office 365, it obviously happens somewhere else outside of your perimeter, and it's quite easy to configure that API connection and pull back those events. And here you see the kind of pattern that you'd expect, where activity by event source is kind of very quiet at night, and then it starts spiking in the morning when people are logging in and doing things. And you can get this breakdown for all the different data sources in Office 365, whether that's OneDrive, whether that's SharePoint, which is kind of a similar thing, and whether that's Exchange as well. And you can see that there's certain activity at certain times. If you want to investigate something, there's multiple ways of doing that. So here, for example, you have one failure in the morning, which at the moment is probably very common, something like a Teams meeting, and you can kind of zoom in and work with it and kind of see what the different failures were at the time. And you can see here that there's Microsoft Stream. You can always go deeper and actually see the log message as the platform stored it. And you can kind of see what that error message was in this particular case. But that's not the only way of working with the data. One thing that we really like is something that we call search templates. And if I show you that, that's kind of an interactive dashboard where you get certain levers to investigate your data. And it's also a good start if you want to look at multiple data sources at once, which is one of those themes that Martha's spoken about, and the key strength of a SIEM. It might not only be things happening in your Office 365 or in your AD, there might be things happening on your firewall, on your VPN, and so on. So with a search template, you can bring together those log sources and investigate them at once. So this is one that's pre-built. There's different ones. The element here is the threat hunting, but the concept applies to anything. So if I hit update on this, you get data pulled back from a variety of sources and visualized in lots of different ways. And it's trying to give you all the relevant information if you were to investigate someone's activity. And there's a list of compromised workstations that we might have obtained from something like a vulnerability scanner, get an overview of the authentication activity and what people are connecting to. But the key point is that you have these fields at the right-hand side that the LogPoint administrator can define, and you can then search for certain things, because obviously with all these users in here, and potentially far more than this, this starts to become a bit unwieldy. But if you filter that down to something like just Christopher, and you hit update, it kind of narrows that down, and you can see the machine that Christopher was connecting to and from, and the hashes, file hashes that were exchanged, the authentication, and how that flowed through your environment, and what changes this user made to certain accounts, and so on. So that's a really nice way of visualizing your data and also having some control over what you see, without having to really dive into the LogPoint search language, which is what powers all of this underneath. There's a lot of use cases for this. If you have repetitive tasks, such as understanding your remote connections, and maybe you want to know when did this user log in and start working, you could have a dashboard search template like this, where you can enter their username, or you can enter their workstation name, or whatever else, and it kind of pulls back those results for you, that you can then kind of take away and report on, and so on. But the other big question that I get asked a lot of at the moment is, I've got these remote users, they are connecting to my corporate VPN. How would I even know what's going on with those kind of connections? And that's why I just wanted to give you a brief example of the search that powers all of this. You've seen a glimpse of it when I dived straight into the logs a bit more deeply. So I'm going to search my Cisco repository that I have in LogPoint, and I'm running an empty search, so you essentially get 2,000 logs back for the last few hours that came from my Cisco ASA, and you can see what LogPoint does with those log messages that are arriving. So you can always see the clear text message at the bottom there, which, depending on the device, look more or less pretty. And then the messages get translated into the LogPoint taxonomy, which you can see up here. That's the individual fields as contained in that log message. And the challenge is, how do you figure out what's going on with something like this that keeps logging every few seconds a message? So firstly, you get these interesting fields on the left-hand side, which is quite useful. You can see that there's a few messages like action that are in almost all the messages, but then there's a few other fields that maybe data size isn't as common. You can click on these right from here and see, okay, what's the breakdown of the different source addresses that were in here, or indeed, what were the action messages. The other thing you might spot is these here that we call labels, and they are really useful to make sense of these log messages. And they are all pre-built and come with the devices as you bring them in. So instead of really having to understand something like this, this is a connection teardown, we know this because we know that message, and you can search for that. So if you want to know what's going on with your VPN, the nice thing is you can search for these labels just like anything else in LogPoint, and you maybe just do something like this in your ASA logs, and there we go. We can see some messages that pertain to a VPN. And the other thing is that you can see here, there's actually a start VPN message in there. So if that's what we want to know, how many VPN connections have there been, I can add that to my search by clicking on it, and you get 8 messages back that you can see how over time these were the different start messages. And that's how you start building searches in LogPoint. And they can be as simple as this. Obviously, the search language is far more powerful, but you don't have to use all the functionality. Sometimes it can be really simple, and you can also maybe just visualize this now with some statement like this. So if you want to see all the source addresses that came in with a VPN start message, you can see those here. Now, there's a lot of other things you can do with this. You could look that up as geolocation, perhaps, and work out which country maybe this comes from. And if you have something like that coming from somewhere you're not happy with, you might want to be alerted on that. So that's really the next area then. If you have visibility of your connections and your VPN requests and so on, you might want to be proactively alerted when something happens. And if we take a look at the incident management in LogPoint, this is where any alerts that are created would appear. And you can see some examples that we've turned on here. That some of them are pre-built, some of them we might have created ourselves, and they get raised so that you can take action through multiple users, maybe in LogPoint, that can take ownership and resolve these things. One example here, again, in the context of user management and handling, maybe that's something you want to know about. If someone keeps changing their password within a few minutes, they either have a problem or someone's doing something that they shouldn't do. And from this incident, you can quickly get an overview. Okay, so who were the users that did this? You can see, okay, that's the usernames. I've changed them twice. That's probably not too bad. But depending on what they do and how they do it, that might be of interest. If we take a look at the pre-build rules, there are, if I don't filter on Windows, you can see there's 22 pages worth of these, and there's some for Office 365 and some for Windows. Those are pre-build rules that search the LogPoint data, and if something matches, they raise that as an incident, as we've just seen. So if we look at what comes with a Windows package, there's a few good ideas in there as to what you might want to know about. Here, for example, what's a brute force attack? That's obviously a matter of definition, but if someone fails to log in 10 times and then successfully logs in, then firstly, your account lockout probably isn't working right. And secondly, that is probably quite unusual. And there's a lot of these examples, although I would make the point that you probably don't want to turn all 40 on that come predefined, or at least, or it's actually more than that, but at least think about what they mean and how they apply to your environment. Over time, you might refine them. Maybe use certain lists of users that are whitelisted and blacklisted. Maybe you just want to know about your external consultants that might be logging in and those kind of things. That's all possible by making changes to the alert rules by using that same search language that I've just shown you. So this concept of alerting and proactively alerting is kind of driven by knowing in advance what you might want to be informed about. And that's really, as Martha has explained, where UEBA, the machine learning engine, comes in and adds another layer on top of this. So if we look at the UEBA dashboard and the amount of data that we've analyzed, you can see that we've analyzed 120 million events. And again, that's really the strength of a SIEM. There's very few tools out there that can process this amount of data and process this crucially from multiple data sources. Whether that's cloud sources, whether that's your VPN connections, whether that's an antivirus, whatever else it might be. And you can see that out of these millions of events, we found some anomalies and in summary found some entities that we currently consider actively risky. And you can see the machine learning models that got triggered and what stages of the cyber kill chain they essentially might be indicating. Because that is the challenge nowadays. It's not just someone breaking the perimeter. Your perimeter is probably constantly broken, especially with people working from home. And it's no longer just a single thing that you need to find. There's still a place for it in traditional alerting. Maybe there's some malware hashes or some very specific patterns of privilege escalation or certain things that you can find just by searching in your logs. But equally, there will be a sequence of events across multiple log sources that might be occurring and indicate activity that otherwise you wouldn't spot because it's happening across a long period of time, maybe even several different accounts. So if we dive in to this specific day and look at what the machine learning engine found in terms of sensitive, risky behavior, you can see that on the left-hand side, there are certain users, you might remember Joshua from earlier, that have certain risk scores assigned. So there are some low-risk events that have happened, and there's a cluster here of events that we considered high risk. And the reason why we considered them high risk is not because we somehow tell the system, and failed Active Directory login, that's a 12. Instead, it's the deviation of the norm or from the baseline. How different is this behavior, both for this specific user as well as for other users like him that normally behave the same, but suddenly don't. So how different is this? And if we ramp up the risks rating here and just look at the sequence of events of Joshua, you can see there's a few different things that happened that all conspired to lead to this higher risk. And the data sources for this are pretty universal. There's not a specific requirement on a specific vendor, although obviously we need to have the data in the SIEM. So that's where the underlying SIEM comes into play. So key source there is Active Directory again, any kind of login activity, but also VPN logs, is someone connecting remotely. Even things like file share access, exchange, maybe mail traffic, printer logs if someone exfiltrates that way. So there's quite a few sources that we can look into and run these models against. I think Martha's mentioned it earlier. This is a great example of why UEBA is different than just an alert-based system that's search-based. Joshua has a certain set of working hours that is normal for him. And his normal working hours are actually quite late in the evening. So this would be a real challenge to define just as a rule, because you would probably need different rules for different groups of users. You need some for the early shift, some for the late shift. Maybe if some people work from abroad, they have different time zones and so on. So quickly, creating rules for this becomes difficult and either work intensive or it just can't be done. UEBA, on the other hand, works this out on its own because it analyzes this specific user's behavior. So Joshua performed an activity here that was quite early, and that's unusual for him. But as Martha has explained, you don't want to have an alert just because this happened. If you did that, you'd have the age-old problem of false positives in a SIEM. Instead, this is something that we take into account when we look at the other activity that then occurs. One other thing that Joshua did here is send a lot of data using a post request, which is a very unusual way of sending that much data. And maybe people would attach a photo in their Gmail account, but they wouldn't send 1.3 gigabytes that way. That's risky because it's unusual for Joshua and it is unusual for everything else, everyone else. And you can see how different from the norm that is. And it's those sequences of events. In this case, that came from a web proxy. The earlier one was just the login information from Active Directory. So you can see how this builds up a picture just because behavior is different, rather than you having to go in advance and creating rules that might anticipate this kind of behavior that you might never think about, or at the very least don't have the time to create and maintain. So that is another good way of understanding what your users are doing without necessarily having to monitor them specifically or search specifically. And instead, what you could do is create a alert like any other that, in this case, just looks at the risk rating of the user or indeed entity that performs that activity. So rather than having hundreds of different alerts, maybe just have an alert for the risk rating, and when something like this happened, then have a look and investigate further from that point onwards. Just a point to make, this can be looked at from a different perspective. It's not just users. You can look at it from a server perspective. Is there a server that people don't normally fail to log into? Suddenly there's 20 people that have never tried to log into this before, and they have a failed login attempt. That could definitely be some kind of brute force attack trying to find credentials and so on. So I hope that was useful, kind of trying to bridge the gap between the actual use case that people are trying to address and how you might actually use a SIEM to productively do that through the searches, through the alerts, and also through UEBA.
Thank you so much for that, Niels. Like I mentioned at the start of the webinar, we have some time here to answer any questions that you may have. I can see we have a couple of questions already in the Q&A chat, but please feel free. If anything you want to ask us about LogPoint will be presented here today, please go ahead and enter it in the chat and we'll do our best to answer. So Neil, should we go ahead and take the first question?
Yes. So there is a question. What's your experience with APIs between LogPoint SIEM and other security tools like identity and access management? That's a very good question. I guess there's two different aspects to that. So firstly, there are lots of ways of bringing in log data into LogPoint, and certainly any kind of security tool is a viable candidate for that. So we'd very much like to know about identity and access management logs. There's a few vendors that we support. Often it is simply things like syslog, log messages, or indeed a file collection. But we certainly also have API connectivity with certain vendors. Office 365 is the most obvious example because you don't get that in a log file, but there can be others. So that's the first thing, being able to get log data into LogPoint. Once we have that, it's easy to do pretty much all of what I've shown with that specific angle of what that security tool actually does. And then the second question is something that does come up from time to time. Which is, can you use LogPoint to drive other security tools? And the answer there is yes as well. And that's something that there are specialist vendors out there for, such as DF Labs and Swimlane, and they kind of are sole vendors for security orchestration. That's a different skill set than just a SIEM. But in addition to that, we can, on the back of these alerts, trigger things like scripts and indeed REST calls, maybe against a REST API. We don't really have that kind of pre-built, but certainly if you're comfortable with the security tools that you are using and their interfaces, then you can make that happen from within LogPoint. We do have some examples of that. People trying to disable an account automatically if something happens to it as seen by the SIEM, or maybe shut down a specific firewall port or something like that. So there are customers that do that. Oh, there's been quite a few. The second one was, how do you handle IoT devices? Again, interesting question, and very broad in terms of what's an IoT device. And the answer is very similar to what I've just said. It's always twofold. One is, how do we get the log messages? And two, what do we do once we have that information? So as long as we can somehow get to those log messages, then there's absolutely no reason why we can't handle them. It kind of depends a bit on how they make themselves known. If they can just send their messages somewhere or use a centralized kind of repository for it, then that helps too. And then depending on what it is, we either normalize it already because we understand it, or we can create that free of charge and support if that log message needs interpretation by us. But there's no reason why we couldn't do it. Let me just see. Next one. How do we forward logs from diff data sources to LogPoint? Is it an agent installed from different data sources? There's only one agent that we have available if you choose to deploy it, and that's a Windows agent that you can potentially install on your Windows servers or indeed on your endpoint. The reason why we have that is that we offer a bit more functionality there in terms of encryption, caching on the machine, and also file integrity monitoring and registry monitoring, which you can't just do by collecting an event log. But equally, especially if we're talking about lots of endpoints, you might be wanting to look at something like Windows Event Forwarding or bake an agent into a golden image that isn't ours. So there's multiple ways of doing that. That's the only agent. Everything else, we either reach out through APIs, which is Office 365, for example, or Salesforce or AWS, or we collect and fetch using standard methods such as syslog, SNMP, WMI, FTP, those kind of things. So yeah. How many kinds of logs does LogPoint collect out of the box? Can you do manual parsing to get logs that are not supported out of the box? Yes. So firstly, I think last I counted it was 430 different vendors or products. Sometimes there's more than one. That's kind of the pre-built stuff. I've alluded to it earlier. If you have a commercial product that creates log messages as like many other customers would have, and we somehow don't support it, then you can raise that as a support ticket and they do it free of charge. That can be a difference to lots of other vendors where you kind of wait for that for months and years and or have to pay for that. But if you do want to do it yourself, you can certainly do that too. It's ultimately based on regular expressions, but there's a special simplified version of regex that you can use to create these normalizers. I've done it myself quite a few times. It's not too difficult. And it depends on how comfortable with that you are, and also what your log messages are and how complicated they are. But you can do that yourself if need be. Is there a specific search language used to create reports and dashboards? It is the same search language everywhere, and yes, it is a LogPoint specific search language. It's largely based on key value pairs, as you saw. If you are familiar with something like SQL, it's a bit like a SQL statement. There are things like joins and so on as well. But that is something that's kind of LogPoint specific. There is quite a bit of help available, both inline with autocomplete and a little drop down, as well as in the documentation. And there's obviously also training courses. The best way I find to learn is to look at what's pre-built. Look at the pre-built dashboards, look at the pre-built alerts. There's a lot there that you can spy on and work out, oh, that's how they do that. And I add another filter and then it does what I need it to do. So that's how I learned about it. Does LogPoint have its own format for logs like ArcSight CEF, Curator Leaf, Elastic ECS? Not in terms of what we are expecting inbound. And in fact, some of those like CEF and Leaf, we support normalization of. So for us, it's just a matter of whether that's a log format that we understand. And as I said, there's 400 plus of those. We obviously store them internally in a way that you won't see, but there's no specific requirement. And the agent in kind of creates its log messages just as an abstraction of the event logs. So that's another way you get them in. What's your take on threat intelligence feed? Does LogPoint have any own feeds like other SIEM tools? So we support a lot of threat intelligence feeds. Our position with threat intelligence feeds, as well as certain other things that sometimes get kind of included in SIEM, is that there are people out there that do this day in and day out, and they probably do it better than us. So our philosophy is very much, if you have a threat intelligence feed that you know works for you, that maybe you pay for, or you use something free like a Stix Taxi feed or a Critical Stack feed, then by all means we have the integration in LogPoint to bring that in, but we don't supply our own intelligence as such. Is it possible to integrate SOAR technology? And also, I'm not having a perfectly synchronized CMDB as well. So yes, there is integration with SOAR technology. There's a few that are kind of in the final stages. There's also some that are already integrated. And in terms of CMDB, that's an interesting data source for us. Sometimes the boundaries are blurred between a SIEM and a CMDB, but the way we normally use that is to bring that in as a data source in LogPoint. There's various ways of doing that, either through an ODBC connection into the database, or maybe a CSV file that's exported from there. And then we use that information to enrich the logs, i.e. add information from the CMDB to the logs that you can then use to visualize and filter and search and alert. So I hope that answers that question. Can you ingest logs from Windows via WELC or WMI? Not sure what WELC is. Windows Event Log Collection, maybe? So yes, if that's what it is, yes, and WMI as well. So those would be two of those methods of not using a LogPoint agent. And especially in bigger environments, customers often deploy an event log collector, and they have a LogPoint agent just on that, but have a group policy for all their endpoints that forwards that within Windows functionality. WMI we can do as well. Obviously, it doesn't have quite as much information available, but yeah. How long does it take UEBA to learn what's normal? That is kind of, you get information out of UEBA relatively quickly, but it gets better over time. And we normally say you probably want to have about 30 days of data under your belt before you really kind of action what's coming out of it. That's mostly based on the fact that you'd want probably several weekends kind of in there as well. And there's just fluctuations. If you just did a week of data, you probably get baselines, but they might not be entirely accurate. Is it possible to automatically let LogPoint anonymize and aggregate data that is older than, say, 2 weeks or 1 month? I guess I would ask what the use case is specifically, but we can anonymize data in LogPoint. Not so much after a specific time period, but we can do that on ingestion. And it's based, it's data privacy, it's called. It's based on specific fields. So if you get log messages and maybe there's patient data in there or a credit card number or whatever else might be, you might say this is a sensitive field, please apply privacy to it. And that means we store it in an encrypted hashed way. And anyone that actually wants to see the value of that field, they see it's there, but it's just gobbledygook. It needs to go through a 4 eyes approvals process where they get granted access to this field for a specific time frame from a specific user in LogPoint. And then obviously once that is in that form, you can create reports for time periods and so on. But that's kind of applies across the board for that field. About reporting, is it possible to consume LogPoint events to do reports with other tools like Tableau, Jasper reports, or similar? The reports can export or create reports in various formats. That's the extent of what that kind of integration would look like. So if you are happy with a CSV file or an Excel spreadsheet that comes out of LogPoint, then you can certainly load that in whatever tool you want. But it's a scheduled report that runs in LogPoint that maybe saves it somewhere and also might email someone. So it's not really a database that you can tap into, although just for completion, that's also available. There is a search API that you can use, REST-based, that you can run a search against the platform and get results back in a response. So maybe that would be a way of integrating. And can you natively integrate log sources from Dell EMC SAN storage equipment? Yes, again, twofold. One is operationally in terms of actual log message status messages from the storage device. And the other one is CEE, which is the file access auditing on EMC filers. That gives you similar functionality than what you'd get from SharePoint and OneDrive, or indeed Windows file auditing, where you can see who's accessed what file and what modifications have they made to this folder, who's deleted something. So that's quite useful. And yes, we can do that too.
On behalf of Niels and myself and LogPoint, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope everyone learned a little bit of something and it was easy to understand. Thank you so much, everyone.